Secretary Malinowski, my first question is on the issue of human rights and the President's visit last week to Saudi Arabia. There are in particular two cases, Raif Badawi and Walid Abu Akar. Do you know if either one of these cases were raised in those meetings, and what are we doing to pressure? There was a bipartisan letter, a group of senators last week urging the President to make human rights a priority during his meeting with the King. Were these cases raised during that meeting, and if not, what else are we doing with regarding to these two people that are jailed unjustly?
These cases have been raised, including at the very highest levels, more than once with the Saudi government. And I know that the President, in his meeting with the King, had an extensive conversation about human rights in Saudi Arabia. I think you may have seen some stories about how intensive that conversation was. We will, I can pledge to you, continue to raise those cases and others, both privately with the Saudi government and publicly where appropriate, until people who are unjustly detained for peaceful expression, as these individuals are released.
Recently, the administration made its countries of particular concern designations, and noticeably absent from the list was Pakistan. A recent example of religious intolerance was the horrific Easter attack in Lahore. What would have to happen, in your view, for Pakistan to be designated as a country of particular concern?
I think there are a lot of tough calls when the Secretary makes these decisions. I think the test is not simply whether there are significant abuses of religious freedom in a particular country, but whether we feel that there is a commitment within the government to try to do something about it. And it's an evaluation that the Secretary makes on a case-by-case basis. We added a country this year. We added Tajikistan because after a lot of diplomatic efforts with the government, we were simply not getting a sufficient or acceptable response from that government to our requests for action on certain issues. With respect to Pakistan, the Secretary made the judgment that the government is committed to trying to deal with this violence.
The Secretary recently made his genocide designation. What steps has the Department taken to prioritize especially vulnerable communities like the ancient Christian or Yazidi communities which have found themselves in the crosshairs of ISIS?
Well, this has been a burning priority for many of us since this conflict with ISIL began. I was in northern Iraq about a month ago. Mr. Chairman, I visited the main Yazidi religious shrine in Lalish, just a few miles north of the front line with ISIL. We are, as I mentioned in my testimony, we have a lot of programs that we're funding to provide direct support, not just humanitarian assistance, but also psychosocial support for people who have faced violence, escaped captivity on the part of ISIL. As you know, the first shots that we fired in this war to liberate territory in Iraq from ISIL were fired to protect the Yazidi people on Mount Sinjar when they were surrounded by the terrorists. And I think this is something that we need to think about with particular focus in the next stage of the military campaign as it focuses more closely on Mosul and the Nineveh plain. I think many, many members of Congress rightly urged us to look at the genocide determination and to call what was happening to the Christians, to the Yazidis, to other minorities by its name. But using the terminology is the easy part. The important thing is that we find a way to liberate these historical homelands of these people in a way that not only defeats ISIL, not only drives away the terrorists, but that enables these communities to go home with dignity and with security. And frankly, that's going to take resources. And I think we're going to be working with you and reaching out to you to talk about what it's going to take to do this in the right way so those people can go home.
Well, you say it takes resources. What additional budget resources are necessary to...
I'm probably not the best person to ask what the total cost of the entire stabilization. It's going to require support for, in the short term, IDPs. For example, as Mosul is squeezed, there will almost certainly be hundreds of thousands of people fleeing that city. There are 2 million people in Mosul, as you know. Those people are going to need to be cared for somewhere by somebody. It's going to require stabilization funds after the liberation of that areas for rebuilding, for restoring institutions of justice. It's going to require training and support for local security forces, including, I would say, some of the local security forces that communities, including the Christian communities, have been forming in that area. We are already beginning to work with those folks. But I think if you look at the various appeals, including the UN appeal just for the humanitarian support, you'll find that a lot more is needed.
Secretary Palmieri, last year there were over 8,600 documented political arrests in Cuba. Cuba remains the only country in the Americas to be classified as not free by Freedom House, and groups such as Human Rights Watch provide details on the myriad of ways that basic rights and liberties are still not respected in Cuba. In light of all of this, why then would the administration request a reduction from the $20 million that's provided annually in recent years in funding to democracy assistance for the Cuban people?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Thank you for the question, Senator. The FY17 request seeks to establish a sustainable level of democracy support in Cuba. We believe the human rights situation there merits continued attention, and our assistance is designed to work with civil society, independent civil society act, promote democratic values, human rights, and advance fundamental freedoms. The level of funding is one that we believe we can execute on the ground there.
So you're saying that we don't think we can spend $20 million, we can't find programs to fund with the $20 million, so that's why you're asking for less? It's very unusual for a government agency to ask for less. That's why I'm bringing up this point. Why would we ask for less?
We believe that's the sustainable level of programming that we can carry out inside Cuba.
Well, what does that mean, sustainable? The amount you can get funded in the future, or sustainable, like that's how much as you can handle?
It's a combination of the amount of money that we believe can be absorbed inside Cuba at this time.
That was not the feeling 2 years ago? Is that a change in position? Because a couple years ago the funding was at $20 million. So what happened with the additional money that was appropriated in those past years?
I'll have to get back to you on what happened to the previous funding, sir.
Well, my point is, you're saying that you don't believe the island can sustain $20 million of spending on democracy programs. There's not enough programs to fund, or that we can sustain $20 million, so that's why you're asking for less. But in past years, there's been more money. Are you saying that money wasn't spent?
Sir,
if you're spending less this year than you were in the past, something that you funded in the past is not getting funded now. Isn't that correct?
I'm sorry, sir.
I can, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, we have spent slightly more than $15 million in the past. I mean, I think what we face every time we make these requests, to be honest, is overall, as you well know, a diminishing pool of resources to do almost everything that we want to do around the world. The way I look at this, Senator Rubio, I obviously, as the head of the Democracy and Human Rights Bureau, I always welcome as much spending as we can do in any country in the world that needs it. I've got, as I mentioned, about $85 million globally for every single country, every single continent in the world to spend on democracy and human rights programs. And I could probably spend more in every single country where we're doing this kind of work. Cuba, at this point, I think next to Iraq, is the country that receives the most human rights and democracy support of any country in the world, and it merits it, given the challenges, given the importance that this issue has to the United States. But I sometimes look at it and say, gosh, I'd love to have more. Sometimes I look at it and say, I'd rather have more than $200,000 for a country in Africa or a country in Asia where that's all we've got to deal with these issues. So those are some of the choices, I think.
So this is basically part of reallocation of resources to be spent somewhere else?
It is.
Within a limited budget?
I think we have a very limited budget. I would say far too limited for democracy and governance around the world. You know the challenges that we've had overall in trying to maintain an adequate level of spending for democracy and governance in a lot of places that we all care about greatly. Cuba is one of them. So it's certainly not a reallocation away from supporting democracy and human rights, but we have hard choices to make within the limited amount of money that we have for that. Obviously, I'd love us to be able to do more in a lot of places.
Senator Boxer. I just have one more question. Mr. Palmieri, I wanted to ask you, there's been a significant uptick in the number of Cuban migrants. Just, for example, from October of last year through February, so just 5-month period, 18,500 Cubans arrived at the Texas Laredo field office. So we're also getting kind of similar reports from the Coast Guard. They say since October of last year, 2,700 Cubans have attempted to enter the U.S. by sea. But what's more concerning is the number of people, we talked about this briefly last week at another hearing, coming in, I think, through Ecuador and Panama and Costa Rica. And if you read the press reports, some of these governments, their body language or attitude is, we're going to put them on a plane and fly them as close as possible to the U.S. border so they can cross in. In essence, we don't want this problem. This is a major developing issue here, and much of this upsurge has occurred since the deal. What is driving this new migration, and what is driving this new migration? What is our position towards those countries that are talking about moving these people? I mean, their attitude is our job is to kind of facilitate them, get them through so they can get to the U.S., which is where they want to go. Second, are we confronting that attitude that they have? And third, what is the best way to stop this?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Senator. The engagement with the countries in the region focuses on encouraging them to ensure safe, legal, and orderly migration. Much of this migration is undocumented and irregular as it passes through the Central America region. There is no question that earlier this year, Costa Rica and Panama worked with the government of Mexico and did airlift almost 8,000 Cuban migrants from both countries to the northern part of Mexico where they crossed into the United States. Costa Rica took the step at that time of making clear that after that backlog was addressed, that they were going to be more aggressive in enforcing their immigration laws and returning people to their last point of origin. We now see an additional backlog of these migrants in Panama, and there is now, at least as reported in the press, talk of another possible airlift between Panama and Mexico. We continue to urge the countries to enforce their migration laws, to strengthen their border controls, and to address undocumented and irregular migration by returning people to their last point of origin. We think that is the best way to...
Well, have we pronounced ourselves against these airlifts? I mean, have we pronounced ourselves against these airlifts, whether it's the one that Costa Rica did or the one Panama's not doing? Because the minute the word gets out that if you can get into this country, they're going to put you on a plane and fly you close to the U.S. border so you can get in, you're encouraging more people to do this. So have we said to them, do not airlift people? I mean, we have significant potential leverage with these countries.
We have worked with all three countries to ensure that they are going to strengthen their border controls and put in place better mechanisms to prevent this undocumented and irregular
Right, that's future, but what about the current backlog? Have we told them do not airlift these people?
We have encouraged the countries in the region themselves to figure out the best solution to this surge of migration, and we believe the best solution is stronger enforcement of their own immigration law.
But we haven't told them not to do the airlift.
We have not told them not to do the airlift, sir.
Okay. What is driving this? I mean, Cuba is repressive. They've been repressive for 60 years. What's the difference now? Is it the fear that the Cuban Adjustment Act is going to go away that's driving people to try to get in here before it goes away?
We have no plans to change the Cuban Adjustment Act at this time, Senator. There continues to be a large migration flow out of Cuba. It reflects the difficult economic and human rights conditions in the country.
And I understand that the administration has no plans to advocate for a change in the Cuban Adjustment Act, which was an act of Congress. But my question is there fear? What I hear is that people in Cuba think the Cuban Adjustment Act might go away now that the situation's been normalized, so they're trying to get into the U.S. before that happens.
I I don't know and can't comment directly on the individual motivations of these Cuban migrants, but I can make clear that the administration is not entertaining any idea of a change to the Cuban Adjustment Act, and so that shouldn't be a factor in their decision calculus.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here today. I appreciate you participating in this, and I think it was informative, and I'm pleased as well that we have so many members attend and ask great questions. Again, we always thank you for the work that you all do on behalf of our country.